All right, we're recording.
All right, welcome to our case study. This is Project One. This is for EFD 620 Measurement and Evaluation. I am Kyle Bailey. We also have our participants Russell Bennett and Clifton Drummond.
Hey,
So,
good.
go ahead.
No, good morning. I'm Russell Bennett.
I'm Clifton Drummond.
So to get us started, we're going to start off by just looking at Miss Esperanza's Algebra 1 class assessment scores. So this is what we're currently assessing. If you can look at the assessment score sheet, we have in our first column just our questions, our multiple choice questions, short answer questions, open-ended questions, and then the combined score. From there, you can go into questions 1 through 28. Here you can see how each student scored, and then we can tell at the end down in the middle down at the bottom we can see the percentage of how many right or wrong that each student got. So for example, we have question one, systems of equations, which they scored a 64% in. Also on this data sheet, we can also see that we have our pre-algebra standards and how we scored in each of those. We have our algebra 1 standards, how we scored, how students scored in each of those and the percentage. And last, we'll have our algebra 2 standards and how they scored each of the questions and the percentage of the questions. Lastly, at the end, you can see on the assessment score sheet how each student scored in each, well, not each student, how the student scored on the average in each question range. So short answers, there was 56%. Open-ended was 38. Combined, we had 56%. And then those who had 60% or higher or 65% or higher. So the first step we went over is what parts of this data catch our attention. So some of the biggest things that caught our attention are question number 7. Here, question number 7, we see that all students scored it correctly. They got 100%. So this was 100% rate. All students grasped this concept very well, and this is identifying functions. So we know that this was taught very, very well. Another thing that we caught is the linear equations. We see this was our lowest performing, and this was all the way down at 31%, which can tell that we might need to reteach or possibly students just didn't grasp this function very well. Do y'all see anything different or anything else that y'all see that pops out on this?
I think, when I was looking at number 7 and kind of all the other questions, just what that stood out to me is how had that question alone got 100%? What was it that was being taught for everybody to kind of get a grasp and understand that particular style of question rather than the open-ended question where only 38% of them got above a 70%. So that was kind of something that was interesting to me of that one question where everybody got the question correct.
Right.
That's exactly what I thought. Everyone that scored 100 on that question.
And then also a big thing that popped out again, like you said, Russ, was the open-ended questions was 38%. So we see that open-ended, the students are really, really struggling with open-ended questions. So that's something that really must probably need to be retaught or figure out why students are grasping this concept so well.
Yeah, exactly right. It was very interesting to kind of see all those uh, the different style scores and how the kids did and how they didn't do well in some of them.
So when we move on to step two, we ask, what does the data tell us? So moving on to step two, we see that the data is telling us that students, like we just said, are struggling with open-ended questions. So this can indicate a lot of things. One could probably be a deeper conceptual understanding or just a written communication of why they just can't get these open-ended questions. Another thing that we see that the data tells us is there are gaps in systems of equations and linear equations. They definitely need attention. And we say this because here you see on linear graphs, which was numbers 18 and 23, on average, we only had 50%. So half of the class got it. Then we go down to linear equations where they're solving 13, 14, 15, 21, 27. 45% of the class got that. Then we move on to systems of equations. Systems of equations we write and solve in parallel perpendicular. 34%, 57%, and 54%. So there are obviously big gaps in those system of equations and linear equations, and those obviously need attention.
Oh, exactly. That gap range right there in between the linear equations and things like that. That's just to me, and I'm not a math person yet or understanding all that. That's just too big of a gap, and trying to be able to close that gap. How can we do that? How can we take this data and close that gap?
Right. And
Now,
then the next,
moving forward, as we continue to talk about what does the data tell us, the data tell us that most students performed well on Algebra 1. They performed well on the number one standards, the SAT easy questions. If you can look, they scored 71% on 3, 16, 18, 19, and 20, and 75% on the linear equations. And they also performed well on multiple choice. Looking down at the multiple choice, you can kind of see that right at 70% scored well on the multiple choice style questions, but you can still look at linear equations and graphs in the write and solve. There's a big gap in the expressions and the equations piece there. We're 50%, 45% on the write and solve. So what are we doing here to help them be 70% or more on the easy questions and the linear expressions, but then that huge gap between equations and graphs and write and solve there. So we're trying to look at this data and figure out how can we get those numbers closer together instead of so far apart. And then continuing to look at it, we looked at what the data does tell us. Now, what does this data not tell us? By looking at everything, we can see that were there specific student misconceptions? Did they not understand some of the things there? How much time was spent teaching each standard? When you get in the classroom, did they spend the same amount of time on standard 1 as they did on standard 3? All right, or was one rushed through and one not to? Is that why we see the big gap in percentages there? And then lastly, whether the objectives were explicitly taught. Did they go thorough? Were they in depth in their teaching? Did they make sure that the students understood that before they moved on? And did they do any type of reteaching? That is kind of, a gray area there. We just don't exactly know how this information was being taught. I don't know if you guys saw anything different, but that's just kind of looking at the data. There's that gray area of how was this taught and how much time was spent on it.
And I think too, Russ, one thing that it does not show us is what was the student engagement levels between all of the things that were being taught. So were they more engaged when they got the multiple choice questions, or they got to the SAT questions, and less engaged when they got to the open-ended questions? And then also, did they go over test taking strategies? We don't know what test taking strategies they went over before they actually got started.
Right. What about you, Cliff? Did you happen to see anything, or what stood out that the data kind of didn't show, or
I agree with y'all on that. The perception of what was going on in that classroom, and was the teacher there every day? Was it could have been a sub in that classroom on a couple of days, things like that, or did the teacher do small groups, pull out where they was working with a certain group and certain group wasn't getting it? It all depends on what was being taught in that classroom and what was going on in that classroom.
Right.
And then obviously with everything, we want to celebrate some of the stuff. We talked about it. Kyle talked about it earlier. One of the first things, question number 7, everybody got 100%. There was nobody that missed that question. So that's something to celebrate with all the students there, that 100% score. The strong performance on basic algebra objectives, solving linear equations, especially number 5, they got 86% scored on that. So we can celebrate that with them. And then the multiple choice questions got 71%. So those are 3 of the areas that I was looking at that we could take away from this data and kind of celebrate these students and their achievements.
So the one thing that I did notice on the open-ended, it was 38% on was a problem. And again, we just discussed the situation on what was being taught, what caused that drop. You know, when you have kids in 71%, or you have someone answer one question that was 100%. So we need to identify really what was going on in that room, and we don't really know that when you start looking at the scores and how it dropped in the open-ended questions. Also, the system of the equations target remediation. You know, question number 8 was 43%, and then number 26 was at 25%. And so, um, again, what was going on those days when that was being taught? The standards, do they have to reteach the standards, or did they have enough time to reteach the standards? So and also then the graphic skills needed reinforcement. You know, question number 1 was 64%. Also, question number 23 was 50%. Um, you know, again, you know, I guess what we need to know is what was going on in that classroom. All right, what are the problems of practice suggested by the data? What do we know? What do we want to know? What are the suggestions moving forward? Um, Again, what do we have a system in place where kids are allowed to have some kind of tutoring sessions, or do they have, you know, are they able being are they actually being pulled out to actually reteach, for the teacher to reteach? Is that time frame? Um, but definitely need to be practiced on the open-ended questions, and find out what the solution is based off the testing results. What are your key conclusions? You know, we talked about several different things as to why and what was the reason why the scores was high in certain areas and why they was low in other areas. Um, you know, I guess y'all can actually help me out on what do you think the recommendations needs to be? Um, you know, what are the assessment alignment? Or, you know, or also you got to look at resource students. How many resource students were possibly in that room when testing was going on? So,
Well,
I
I think
think.
too,
Go ahead,
you know,
Russ.
and I'll come to you, Kyle,
Mhm.
especially looking at it here, as you can see, what type, we talked about in previous slides, the instructional focus within that classroom.
Mhm.
Um, Maybe some of the conclusions we can take from this is that they can emphasize graphing and systems of equations in their lessons, maybe practice those going forward in some of their lessons. And also, we talked about how 38% in open-ended questions. I really think to dedicate the time in learning how to answer open-ended questions and having that extra practice will go a long way in helping their scores improved on future testing scores.
Yeah, in agreement with you, you know, what Cliff said earlier about what was it a sub or what's going there, the teacher support. You know what I'm saying? I think we can make a conclusion that we must get the teachers professional development in teaching things like the graphic and system equations to make sure that they are proficient in teaching graphing linear equations, so it's not a fall off because they don't know what they're doing. So I'm making sure we get those teachers the key support that they need. Also, sharing research-based strategies to enhance student engagement. So just things that have already been researched, we can go ahead and share those with the students so that we can get their engagement up, we can get their understanding up, and making sure we have those key teacher supports in the classroom.
Right.
So lastly, I think we just got to find out an action plan. So with an action plan, the first thing I think we should do is targeting and reteaching for the weak standards. So those weak standards we kept seeing, linear equations, open-ended equations. Um, we need to target those things. I think we should give it a 2-week timeline. And since Miss Esperanza is the main teacher in there, I think that the responsibility should fall on her and any of the support that she has in her class, which may be the paraprofessional or anybody else she has to support with that. The next, I think, is implementing those open-ended practices. So again, open-ended scored 38% amongst the whole class. So obviously everybody needs help with that. So that's be something I feel like that needs to go on every week. Every week we're working on open-ended questions. And again, the whole entire math department, I feel like, could push towards getting that done.
And I think too, you know, looking at the action plan for me was the teacher leader or the department chair, or if they have an instructional coach at that school, they can implement professional development workshops monthly. I know from the school that I'm at, we have professional learning centers every Thursday where all the teachers get together and they go over things that they can do to help these students in the classroom. So I think weekly ongoing meetings between the teachers and bringing in different speakers or different experts from that area will only help these teachers as they go try to teach the problems that these students struggle with. And then looking at interventions twice per week, pulling students out, trying to chunk and give them bits and pieces and to help them be better successful. And you can use that with a support teacher or interventionist or things like that, or another type of teacher within the building that's not an everyday classroom teacher.
All right.
Definitely, administration needs to take a role in this situation too, because they need to be in the classroom to evaluate the teachers to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do. And if they're not, you know, I know here at my school we had to rearrange the whole math department and move some high school math teachers down to the 7th, 8th grade building to change up, to kind of just move some pieces around to try to get our math scores up, because we already know that math scores across the state of Alabama is very low anyway. And so we did that. We did department meetings, and we also have an after-school program to where kids that are not doing so well in math, that they had to stay over after school. And then we also have an enrichment. Just a suggestion, we had an enrichment added to our 7th, 8th grade, where the kids that are not doing so well, based on their math scores coming over from the 6th grade, that we put them in enrichment class to help improve their math scores also.
All right. So to end everything, we appreciate you going over this data with us. Our references, we had the reference page where we had driven by data is what we looked into. Written in 2010, we had the most effective reteaching strategies, which kind of helped us put together that master action plan, And lastly, we had our National Standards Authority, We had a National Standards Authority. And then lastly, we had our Common Core Standards Initiative, where we could kind of look at what was going on in math classes, kind of help put this together. So we thank you and we appreciate you for listening to our presentation.
All right. Appreciate you.